Blog Talk Radio.
Waarmee ons moet lewe, vergans en vermoord en verryp. Ek smoeg vir die bad news, vir Zuma en sy views, van ons op TV moet kyk. Ek wil nie meer hoor hoe ons tieners begrawe, oor niemand hul steur aan die wet. Ek wil nie meer leef van affirmative action, of beklei om te hou wat ek het. Gee vir my 'n nuwe gees, 'n kosse plezier en 'n tellerij, wat lief, eten en stry, voor die mooi van ons land en ons reg om hier te kan bly. Ek stiek vir Malema, sy leuns en sy sê maar, ons hou maar ons mond en betaal. Ons kruip weg in kampe, voor blind vir die rampe, en bid dat die Heer ons omhaal. Daar's Winnie Mandela, wat mense verbrand het, maar nou wil sy huil in haar hand. Die staatskas is leeg en die ANC saai verwoesting en pyn hier ons land. Gee vir my 'n nuwe gees, 'n kosse plezier en 'n tellerij, wat lief, eten en stry, voor die mooi van ons land en ons reg om hier te kan bly. Het betaal vir die grond, waar sy kinders kan bly. Maar sy huis en sy lande is nou in die hande van die vyand teen wie hy moes stry. Ons kinders verstaan nie, waar kom ons vandaan nie, al erfenis is uitgewis. Geen volkslied of vlag nie, en geen erewag nie, vir die helde wat daar nie meer is. Gee vir my 'n nuwe gees, 'n kosse plezier en 'n tellerij, wat lief, eten en stry, voor die mooi van ons land en ons reg om hier te kan bly. Gee vir my 'n nuwe gees, 'n kosse plezier en 'n tellerij, wat lief, eten en stry, voor die mooi van ons land en ons reg om hier te kan bly. En ons reg om hier te kan bly.
Welcome to Radio Free South Africa, brought to you courtesy of Rage Against the Regime podcast. This is your host, Karen Smith. Today, I want to bring you a message from John McManus of the John Birch Society. Listen carefully to what he has to say about Africa and the New World Order, and think how relevant this message is to the whole world today. He said in 1988 that powerful internationalists seek to turn the dark continent red. And is that not where the whole world is right now? So, without further ado, please listen and learn.
today to say a few words about the conspiratorial drive for one world government as it pertains to the African continent. For many decades prior to the middle of the 20th century, much of the African continent, especially Black Africa, had benefited tremendously from European presence. The colonial influence of such nations as England, France, Belgium, and Portugal had brought Africa stable governments, hospitals, schools, and agricultural expertise. Missionaries had helped to bring civilized attitudes to warring tribes. The benevolent influences had already led to a growing native class of doctors, educators, and businessmen. The future looked increasingly bright for the dark continent, but progress was not what one-worlders in the West wanted. They wanted control. In one of history's most shameful abdications of responsibility, the European powers submitted to cries for independence and one man, one vote. Communist-inspired revolutionaries who were more easily characterized by the redness of their political views than the blackness of their skin perpetrated incredible atrocities on their own people and on others. It was for these revolutionaries that these nations were created, and each was immediately given international status by the United Nations and recognition by the West. France turned over Algeria to communist Ahmed Ben Bella in 1959. Algeria at the time was just as much a part of France, it was not a colony, as was Marseille or Paris. But it didn't matter to the political manipulators, though it certainly mattered in time to the people in Algeria. Belgium abandoned the Belgian Congo to communist Patrice Lumumba in 1960. Lumumba was so important to communists that a Patrice Lumumba University was created in the USSR, and it's still there today. When the mineral-rich province of Katanga in the Congo sought to secede from the chaos caused by Lumumba's government in 1961, the United Nations went to war against Katanga. Katanga's pro-Western, anti-communist black leader, Moise Tshombe, begged the United Nations to cease its bombing of hospitals and civilians in its attack on the productive element in Katanga. 46 doctors at the Elizabethville Hospital in Katanga sent an anguished plea to the world's leaders, condemning the United Nations and begging to be left alone. If anyone needed to know what the UN really stood for, its military attack on Katanga supplied the story. The photos in this book show what the United Nations did in Katanga. By the mid-1960s, the communist and One World-inspired anti-colonialism campaign had reached its peak. Communists and pro-communist leaders emerged in nation after nation. Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Sekou Touré in Guinea, Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, Kenneth Kaunda in Zambia. The chief characteristics of each of these emerging nations was one man, one vote, one time. Economic progress ceased, civilization was set back, and the only things that grew in each of these nations were government and debt. Portugal held out the longest, but by the middle of the 1970s, she was drained by years of guerrilla warfare in her overseas provinces. Again, not colonies, overseas provinces of Angola and Mozambique. Following the pattern of other black African, newly independent nations, Angola and Mozambique fell into the hands of pro-communist revolutionaries. The forces of international conspiracy then turned their attention to Rhodesia. Under the leadership of Ian Smith, Rhodesia had declared her complete independence from England in 1965. Here was a nation where prosperity was the norm. For the blacks, there was more education, better health care, a higher standard of living, and a brighter future than anywhere else on the continent. But the mania for black majority rule took over, and several communist-supplied revolutionary groups began their campaigns of savagery, mostly against blacks, but also against whites, to create the chaos and anarchy that would destroy the reigning government and allow them to take power. In 1970, a United Nations resolution condemned Rhodesia and urged the world to supply moral and material assistance to Rhodesia's enemies operating out of Zambia to the north. Later, the same urging was applied to Mozambique to the east and Angola to the west. When these Marxist-led nations suffered because they had cut themselves off from food, electricity, and jobs that they got from Rhodesia, the United States government sent aid to make up the difference. In 1976, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger actually went to Zambia to promise such aid. Rhodesia could have handled its problems with the revolutionaries, but it could not cope with the betrayals, isolation, sanctions, and pressures it received from so-called friends, England and the United States. For a time, it seemed as though Ian Smith's government could survive as long as South Africa to its south could be relied upon. Ian Smith vowed not to negotiate with the rebels, led by Joshua Nkomo and Robert Mugabe. But in late 1976, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger pressured South African leader John Foster to induce Smith in Rhodesia to negotiate. Eventually, he did so, and eventually he capitulated to black rule. And now Rhodesia is Zimbabwe. One man, one vote, one time has triumphed again. Robert Mugabe has ascended to power over the bodies of hundreds, perhaps thousands of innocent victims. The United Nations, England, and the United States, and practically all of the world recognize him as a legitimate leader. He has successfully destroyed all opposition to his rule, white or black, and is a totalitarian dictator. But he is favored by the West as well as by communists. All of what we're talking about here is only some evidence of a world conspiracy that grips most nations, a conspiracy that actually is above communism. It's not led by the Soviet Union. Soviet Union supplies the revolutionary element of the conspiracy. The evolutionary leaders are in the West, chiefly in England and especially in the United States. These twin pressures force good leaders to give up. The resulting new government in nation after nation submits to the socialistic one-world system that is being built. The one-worlders in the United States, Britain, and elsewhere don't care if their efforts lead to communist rule or to socialist rule, as long as the new ruler submits to their designs and becomes part of a new world order. The real issue is never black rule or white rule, or Muslim rule in Algeria versus French-speaking rulers. The real issue is submission to the new world order being arranged by such forces as England's Royal Institute for International Affairs, America's Council on Foreign Relations, and their creation, the United Nations. Looking at this problem another way, the real issue is independence for nations and, of course, freedom for the people versus loss of sovereignty for the nation and bondage to the communist socialist system for the people. Look at South Africa. If all the lies spoken about this nation in the past 10 years were true, which they surely are not, the human rights record for all its people would still exceed that of most of the world. A friend once told me South Africa's supposed denial of human rights is still far less reprehensible than all communist nations, most nations of Asia, and virtually all of the dictatorships in Africa. But much of South Africa's supposed horrors are myths, something that we have already written about in our Birchlog column entitled The Myths About South Africa. If South Africa is indeed so horrible, which it is not, why do blacks continue to stream into the nation? If the West, and chiefly the United States and the United Nations, were honest crusaders for human rights, why don't they direct their attention to the plight of billions behind the iron and bamboo curtains, thousands of whom are held in prisons, slave labor camps, and detention centers for no other crime than being victims of communist terror? Communist atrocities are real, not myths. Why not direct attention to the vicious caste system in India or the way women are treated in Muslim nations? Why not make sure that we in the United States are perfect before we tell others to correct their real or imagined sins? Americans ought to be asking why we are so anxious to cut ourselves off from supplies of strategic minerals that we have been getting from South Africa. Chrome, platinum, manganese, vanadium, and other metals that are needed for high-temperature steels, for jet engines, for oil refining equipment, and even a host of everyday use items found in our homes. If we don't get these minerals from South Africa, we are forced either to get them from the Soviet Union or do without, because we don't have them within our own shores. We are indeed committing suicide. We trade with and send aid to the Soviet Union, but we impose sanctions on South Africa. Why? The only answer is because the leaders of the United States are committed to the creation of a one-world system. They are perfectly willing to weaken the United States, even to destroy its independence to satisfy their global designs. For decades, these individuals, typified by Council on Foreign Relations members who have dominated our government for most of the 20th century, have destroyed other governments friendly to the United States and forced communist or socialist one-worlders on nation after nation. Think back. Think back to nationalist China in the late 1940s being betrayed by the United States and Chiang Kai-shek's government having to flee and to turn that nation over to the hands of the bloodiest murderers that the world has ever known, the Red Chinese. Think back to the 1950s when the United States government destroyed Cuba's government under Fulgencio Batista and invited Castro to take power. Castro, whom they knew to be a communist. Go back to the 70s and Ian Smith and what happened to him in Rhodesia as a result of the pressure that came from the United States and elsewhere. Think back to 1979, Anastasio Somoza of Nicaragua betrayed by the United States and forced to abdicate, and the Sandinista communists took that country. Or to 1979 when the Shah of Iran was destroyed by our government and the Ayatollah Khomeini, a vicious and violent anti-American, took power. Think back to just a few years ago when we see Ferdinand Marcos, who wanted to be a friend of the United States, see him exiled and taken from his own country by Americans, and the Philippines continues to move further and further to the left. And now, South Africa. President Reagan, on September 9th of 1985, sent the following official message to the Congress of the United States. I hereby report to the Congress that I have exercised my statutory authority to declare that the policies and actions of the government of South Africa constitute an unusual and extraordinary threat to the foreign policy and economy of the United States, and to declare a national emergency to deal with that threat. That's incredible. That's absolutely incredible. While we have a nation like the Soviet Union invading its neighbors, causing unrest and trouble all over the globe, financing Cuba that finances Nicaragua, and the President of the United States is moving heaven and earth to have us deal with them more, to have more trade with them, to supply them with more aid, to welcome them into the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and many other things. And while all this is going on, we are deciding that South Africa is a threat to the United States. Well, of course, that led to the Anti-Apartheid Act of 1986, the official name of that sanctions bill. And it called for U.S. funding of anti-apartheid South African groups. It called for the termination of U.S. military cooperation with South Africa. It called for pressure on Western allies to apply similar punitive measures. It called for the unbanning of terrorist organizations such as the African National Congress and the release of what they called political prisoners with the name Nelson Mandela mentioned by name. In his remarks on the Senate floor in opposition to the sanctions bill, Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina noted that the measure, he said, it's not about segregation, it's not about the sharing of power, it's about the transfer of power to a small minority elite. That elite, said Senator Helms, is the Communist Party of South Africa. He went on to talk about the intent of the new legislation is to recognize the communist movement of South Africa as the legitimate and preferred successor to the present government of that nation. The bill itself, he said, gives preference in almost every respect only to those opponents of the government and those groups that are deeply committed to the Communist Party of South Africa or an organization funded and controlled by the Soviet Union. The non-communist leaders of the blacks and non-whites are treated as though they do not exist. This is what the South Africa Sanctions Bill of 1986 accomplished. The senator from North Carolina then asked, why is it that only persons mentioned by name in the bill are communists? Why is it that the only parties referenced are precisely those parties which are under total control and support of the international communist movement? And yet, even after Senator Helms' testimony before his colleagues in the United States Senate, 84 United States senators voted for the sanctions, and it passed the Senate, and it passed the House, which certainly demonstrates the serious problems that exist in our country and that we must be busy about. One response to Senator Helms' remarks came from the Council on Foreign Relations publication called Foreign Affairs. In an article written by Professor Thomas Karras of the City University of New York City in the winter 1986-87 issue of this magazine, we see an article called South African Liberation, the Communist Factor. Professor Karras in the article says very bluntly and very boldly, there is no Soviet influence in the African National Congress. This, of course, is completely false. Are there communists in the African National Congress? A 1982 Senate committee headed by Senator Jeremiah Denton of Alabama published its belief in 1982 that 11 of the 30 leaders of the African National Congress were also members of the South African Communist Party. By 1986, more information had been gained, and a congressman named Dan Burton from Indiana published information that he had assembled, saying that 19 of those 30 top leaders of the African National Congress were communists, were members of the South African Communist Party. In 1986, our own Central Intelligence Agency put together a report, and it had to be pried out of them by Senator Helms, but even they came out with information saying that 18 of the top 30 leaders of the African National Congress were members of the South African Communist Party. In 1986, Oliver Tambo, the head of the African National Congress, a man who himself has never been identified as a member of the South African Communist Party, said, however, quote, the African National Congress and the South African Communist Party have common objectives. How true. On January 23rd, 1987, in response to charges that the organization he leads is controlled by the Soviet Union, Oliver Tambo made the following amazing admission about the weapons that the African National Congress receives from the Kremlin. He said, because we are getting arms from them for free does not mean we are mortgaging ourselves. Does he expect us to believe that Moscow finances what it does not influence? Nevertheless, when African National Congress leader Oliver Tambo came to the United States in January of 1987, he was warmly welcomed by Secretary of State George Shultz. The situation in South Africa, unfortunately, parallels to some degree what is happening in England and in the United States. There are powerful forces in South Africa working in league with the one-worlders and internationalists who are subverting independence wherever it exists and helping communists wherever they operate. America is being betrayed by its own, and the same kind of betrayal may well be unfolding in South Africa. Our Council on Foreign Relations was begun in 1919 at a meeting in Paris at which British participants started their own Royal Institute for International Affairs. The Royal Institute for International Affairs in England, the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States, are twin organizations for the same one world socialist goal. In 1986, in an article I wrote for the New American Magazine, I discussed and commented on the writings of the Council on Foreign Relations founders and on numerous published works of the organization to reach the conclusions that we have stated, that one world socialism is indeed their goal. It is the members of the Council on Foreign Relations in America and the members of the Royal Institute for International Affairs in England that subverted Rhodesia, for example. In South Africa, the huge Anglo-American corporation has been headed by a man named Harry Oppenheimer, who also turns out to be the leader of the South African Institute for International Affairs, a subsidiary of the Royal Institute started in England. There has also been formed the Australian Institute for International Affairs. And during my visit to Australia in May of 1985, I visited the headquarters of the Australian Institute for International Affairs in Melbourne. Confirmation of intense cooperation between the Australian Institute, between the Council on Foreign Relations, and then again the Royal Institute in England, was freely given by the personnel that I met at the headquarters of this organization in Melbourne. One woman I remember meeting told me with great delight that in 1983, the organization, the Australian Institute for International Affairs, had celebrated its 50th anniversary, and they had a gala affair, and the chief spokesman at their affair was a guest from South Africa, Mr. Harry Oppenheimer, the head of the South African Institute for International Affairs. In late 1985, officials of the Anglo-American Corporation, led by Chairman Gavin Relly, journeyed to visit African National Congress leaders in Zambia. Additional contacts have also been made since. The African National Congress is banned in South Africa. Hence, it has set up headquarters in Zambia. And for these prominent industrialists in South Africa to go to Zambia to sit down with the leaders of the African National Congress smacks of the same kind of betrayal that we Americans see more and more when people like David Rockefeller and corporate heads in America journey to Moscow to sit down and discuss things with the leaders of the criminal Soviet Union. All of this smacks of betrayal, somewhat, as I say, like our corporate leaders trading with and supplying the Soviets. And like the U.S., much of the mass media in South Africa is controlled by individuals tied to these one-world groups. The South African government has recently signed a non-aggression pact with the communist government in Mozambique. Early in 1988, the same Gavin Relly, the chairman of the Anglo-American Corporation, showed up in Maputo, the capital of Mozambique, to meet with the communist leaders of that nation. There are even some in South Africa who express the belief that their government should negotiate directly with the Soviets, that the U.S. may in fact be a greater threat to South Africa than are the Soviets. Our Council on Foreign Relations leaders must be delighted. In a recent article appearing in the World Today magazine, the journal of the London-based Royal Institute for International Affairs suggested South Africa-USSR cooperation. Yes, indeed, there is a conspiracy. But because there is hope. What we face in America and what others face throughout the world is not so much evolutionary force that can't be stopped, but deliberately caused deeds that can be reversed. If indeed it's a conspiracy, it can be stopped. If it's natural forces just flowing to a consequence, how do you stop them? And so indeed, because there is a conspiracy, there is hope. If we in America can force our own leaders to cease helping communists and to stop hurting friendly nations like South Africa, the world will quickly be a better place. Communist governments will be forced to exist without outside help, and they will quickly collapse. Friendly nations like South Africa will cease seeing their own citizens emulating the pattern of betrayal that grips the West. And loyal South Africans can work out whatever problems exist in their own nation. And this is what we must do in America. We must wake the town and tell the people about what our government is doing in South Africa, about what our government is doing to help the communists in the Soviet Union and elsewhere, about what our own government is doing to destroy the economic life of our country. We can do it. We must do it. We have friends all throughout the world who want desperately for us to succeed. So let's be about our business. Thank you very much.
Now, that talk was given by Mr. McManus in 1988. He said that there is hope. We need to pay attention, and we can stop it. However, nobody was paying attention. It was not stopped, and South Africa is now fully under the control of a communist government. One of the people he mentioned in his talk was Professor Karras from City University of New York, who absolutely stated that there is no evidence that the ANC is communist. However, in a book written by him, South Africa and the Communist International, he himself wrote the following: South Africa and the Communist International is a superb documentary achievement. The editors have made a judicious selection of 193 primary documents from the Comintern's archives that carry the story of South African communism from its birth to the end of the 1930s. The documents are transcribed into English, provided with precise citations, obscure names and pseudonyms identified, and distant events and organizations described. An informative introductory historical essay on the history of the Communist Party of South Africa and the Communist International provides needed context. The documents, some brief but others very lengthy, illuminate the CPSA's origins, the Bolshevization campaign of the late 1920s and the early 1930s, the mechanisms of Comintern authority, background of the decision to endorse an independent native republic, the search for ideological deviations, and the tragic fate of the South Africans caught up in Stalin's terror. These two volumes are essential reading for serious students of South African communism and will likely remain so for many decades. The South African Communist Party has been an integral part of the struggle against apartheid in South Africa and a major part of the African National Congress. This has raised for years unanswerable questions about the influence of the Soviet Union on the ANC. This new documentary history of the relationship between the SACP and the Comintern, made possible by the opening of the Comintern archives, makes a major contribution to the history of the anti-apartheid struggle by providing rich material for the 1919 to 1939 period. It throws new light on the controversies and crises surrounding Moscow's 1928 decree that a native republic be established in South Africa, and traces the effects of Stalin's purges, which led to the near collapse of communism in South Africa before World War II, and eventually to the demise of the Comintern itself. Now, as you can see, already in 1928, the fate of white South Africa was practically sealed by the communists. They established the ANC, they funded them, they trained them, they sent them weapons, they established a new university in Moscow with an African name. It has been a long, long battle to turn the dark continent red. And today, except for a very small contingent in South Africa, they have achieved their design. They also spoke about Mad Bob Mugabe, the dictator of Zimbabwe. This is a piece written in 2005. When Zimbabwe's president, Robert Mugabe, systematically burned out white farmers, and murdered them for their valuable land, the civilized world hardly noticed. It was about wealth redistribution, said Mugabe. It was about land reform, he said. Those buzzwords were enough for the international community, and the slaughter continued. Now, Mugabe has turned his deadly attention to the poor, driving hundreds of thousands from their homes in what he euphemistically calls an urban renewal program, or Operation Drive Out Trash. At news conference in Africa and at the United Nations, more than 200 international human rights and civic groups said the campaign was a grave violation of international human rights law and a disturbing affront to human dignity. But words don't mean much to Mugabe. More than 42,000 people have been arrested, fined, or had their goods confiscated. This is just a small sample of what the Communist Party and their regime have done in South Africa. And now, today, white South Africans are struggling, suffering, and literally dying like flies because of a conspiracy formed in 1928, in which the whole world apparently took part. There's an article from March 2010 called The Continuing Saga of South Africa's Dwindling Gun Owners. When not banning guns outright, the gun prohibition lobbies, both in the U.S. and abroad, promote gun owner licensing as a reasonable and sensible regulation. Yet the terrible experience of South African gun owners shows how purportedly reasonable licensing can be used to devastate the culture of responsible gun ownership. Most of what has been done to South African gun owners is already being pushed in the United States. Gun rationing, targeting the poor and people of color, making gun ownership unaffordable, confiscating guns without compensation, and implementing a licensing system that can be deliberately abused in order to stop good people from owning guns. Add to this list a government that plays a leading role in arming violent criminals, and you have the deadly disaster of today's South Africa. The mechanism for gun rights destruction was the Firearms Control Act, passed in 2000 by the South African Parliament. The key force behind the bill was Gun Free South Africa, one of the many global gun ban lobbies founded by George Soros. The governments of Canada, Japan, the United Kingdom, and New Zealand provided advice on the draft law, as did the head of Canada's gun prohibition lobby. South Africa has a long tradition of shooting sports. The first record of an organized sporting event there was the Parrot Shoot, an annual event that began in October 1686. Borrowing from a European tradition in village fairs, Dutch settlers shot at clay or wooden replicas of birds known as papegaai. Unfortunately, South Africa developed a comprehensive series of racial caste laws formalized in 1948 as apartheid. Whites had the most rights, followed by colors, immigrants from Asia, with blacks at the very bottom. One of the first steps in dismantling this evil system was led by South African gun owners. In 1984, the apartheid government proposed limiting the number and types of firearms that individuals could own. A new citizen organization, the South African Gun Owners Association, was created to fight for gun owner rights, and they defeated the government plan. The Gun Owners Association did not stop there. The group began pushing to fix the gun laws so that non-whites could have the same rights as whites. They won this fight in Parliament. However, many police administrators abused their powers and thwarted gun license applications by blacks. Finally, in 1994, apartheid came to a long overdue end when South Africa held its first multiracial free elections. Control of the government passed to the African National Congress, which was fighting a revolutionary war for much of the century. Since then, South Africa has been ruled by the ANC, and year by year, the ANC becomes more and more to resemble the former apartheid regime. Like the apartheid regime, the ANC props up a network of allied dictatorships in southern Africa. Without the support of the ANC, Zimbabwe's genocidal tyrant, Robert Mugabe, would not still be in power. At the United Nations, the South African delegation protects its tyrannical allies, such as Mugabe and the military junta in Burma, by protesting against outside interference with governments that abuse human rights. The current South African delegation's arguments are nearly identical to the arguments that the apartheid regime once used when it insisted that foreigners should remain silent about oppression in South Africa. And, like the apartheid regime, the ANC is an enemy of gun owner rights in general, and of black gun owners in particular. All guns must be registered, the better to enforce the ownership caps. Semi-automatic long guns are not allowed, except for farmers and a few other special categories. The lone self-defense gun must be a handgun or a manually operated shotgun. At its outset, about a third of gun owners had more guns than the FCA allowed, so they were required to sell the guns or surrender them to the government. Section 137 of the FCA expressly promised that compensation would be paid to people who surrendered their excess guns, either because they had too many or because they were enticed by one of the government's voluntary gun surrender programs. More than 600,000 guns have been given to the government, yet the government has yet to pay a penny. In 2005, National Police Commissioner Jackie Selebi said, "You can't be paid for doing away with an evil thing." So that happened in South Africa under this communist regime is about to happen in this country. Obama has clearly stated that he has not given up on stopping guns in the USA. He has not given up on preventing legal citizens having legally owned firearms. But the problem with that is the same as in South Africa. Today, of those 600,000 guns handed in by law-abiding white South Africans, thousands of them have been either lost from police lockups, sold to criminals, or are rented out by those very same police to the criminals for a daily fee. Many of the whites slaughtered on farms and in the towns in South Africa are slaughtered with the self-same guns that this law-abiding people handed in because the law required them to. It is very frightening to me that video played to you by the John Birch Society was made in 1988, and its message resonates so clearly still today. I found an article today about Europe's refugee crisis. Germany alone is to receive 800,000 refugees this year. That is 1% of the entire German population. At this rate, within 10 years, there's an extra 10% of people from completely different cultures thrown into the German population like random cooking ingredients. What kind of sick social experiment is this? Why is it the responsibility of any European country to give these refugees something they can't do or build on their own? The third worlders look at our civilization like a child looks at an amusement park, something fantastic and much better than what they have. All they have to do is stake a claim to it. Has any European country benefited by opening its borders to non-Europeans? Name one. Do they make Europe a safer place to live? Have they made Europe great? Are they good for tourism? Do they bring anything positive to Europe? Do they respect the citizens of Europe and the customs? Do they support themselves without burdening the taxpayers? Do they burden the judicial system due to high crime rates? Do they love Europe or what they can get from her? Do they victimize the European people in large proportion to their small numbers? Wouldn't crimes against the European people foreshadow their true intentions? Do they trash up the areas they inhabit in Europe? If they victimize the host country's people and trash up their land after they've been given a new start in life, wouldn't they be like a direct screw you? Do they demand you to change your ways and customs so they can tolerate you? Do they respect the people's government, your family, your people, your culture? If they are guilty of 3 of these questions, then it would be safe to say they should not be in Europe. There is more harm than good for Europe and her people. If a European country doesn't let the hordes flood their land, they're called racist and Nazis. But if they let them in, their country, their lives, their descendants' lives will be torn apart. Which one is easier to live with? Which one does the most damage? Which choice is beneficial to the European country and its people? Wake up before it's too late. Now, those words were written for Germany, but do they not as much apply to America as it is today? Is not one of the biggest debating issues in this country today the immigration question? Does Donald Trump receive rave reviews for his way of dealing with the illegal immigrants? Are Americans called racist, Islamophobes, and all kinds of other horrible names because they do not appreciate these people flooding across the open borders of this country, murdering, slaughtering, raping, costing fortunes in education, in the jails, living on handouts, being given tax refunds for years back where they never paid taxes. The same thing that the John Birch Society was talking about in the piece I just played to you is playing out before your very eyes today. And yet we were warned. We were warned 18 years ago that this was happening and that the USA was as much at fault as any other nation in the world. Americans are being displaced in their own country. The veterans from our wars are homeless. They receive poor care from the VA. And yet, before you even cross the border, you are promised by the American government that you will be given food stamps, a place to stay, free medical, driver's licenses in your own language, and everything else that the declining tax base in America has got to pay for. This is a mirror image of what is and has been happening in South Africa for 20 years. The South African tax base is 6 million strong out of 70 million people. The country has just about reached tipping point where the taxpayer can no longer support the people who need from them. Because in South Africa, at least 5,000 Zimbabweans are crossing those borders every single day. And that is only an estimated amount. We don't know how many. That is approximately 40,000 a week. How does any country who is struggling financially and has the highest tax burden in the world able to take in these people, care for them, support them, feed them, provide them with hospital services, schooling, and everything else that the ANC government has promised the people free of charge? It is impossible. And the burden on the taxpayer has become too great. All services in that country are breaking down. The electricity supply, you can almost kiss it goodbye because no maintenance has been done in the last 20 years. They are now talking about water rationing because, as said by the Minister of one of the ministers in the South African Parliament said, the apartheid government is at fault for the shortage of water because they built the dams too big. If they had built more smaller dams, they wouldn't take so long to fill up, and the country would have an overabundance of water. Given that mentality, how do you expect a country to run? The South African Airways is bankrupt. The post office is in disrepair. It's hardly functioning at all. The airways have refused to take letters on the airlines because their bills are not paid. Eskom is now, in an article I read today, they're being forbidden to buy coal from the companies because they do not pay their bills. So the power stations will cease to function totally in very short time. Things in the world are very scary, and the answer in South Africa is to form alliances with China, Cuba, and Russia. Russia is in the process of tendering for nuclear power stations in South Africa. Now, in a country where they cannot maintain coal power stations and keep the lights on, how is this going to end? If they build 3 nuclear power stations in South Africa, it is a recipe for total disaster. It cannot end well. The ANC is saying it needs more land for RDP housing. RDP housing is the houses that they're building, sub-economic housing, I think you would call it in America. They are sold to the black populace practically free. However, the ones that they have already built are unlivable. They are falling down. They're shoddy workmanship, shoddy materials. And the government owns most of the land in South Africa. And yet, this is just another ploy to steal land from people in South Africa for the same reason that Robert Mugabe has given redistribution of wealth. And the world will continue to look on and say what a good job the communist government is doing. And I would like to just end on this note. Why are Afrikaner farmers being murdered in South Africa? This is a report is a result of an intensive personal inquiry into South Africa conducted in 2012 by Gregory H. Standen, president of Genocide Watch. He says, deliberate inaction of the South African government has weakened rural security structures, facilitating Afrikaner farm murders in order to terrorize white farmers into vacating their farms, advancing the ANC's Communist Party's new democratic revolution. The South African government for the last 18 years has adopted a policy of deliberate government abolition and disarmament of rural commandos run by farmers for their own self-defense. The policy has resulted in a 4-fold increase in the murder rate of Afrikaner commercial farmers. This policy is aimed at forced displacement through terror. It advances the goals of the South African Communist Party's new democratic revolution, which aims at the nationalization of all private farmland, mines, and industry in South Africa. Disarmament, coupled with government removal of security structures to protect the white victim group, follows public dehumanization of the victims and facilitates their forced displacement and gradual genocide. Afrikaner farm owners are being murdered at a rate 4 times the murder rate of other South Africans, including black farm owners. Their families are also subjected to extremely high crime rates, including murder, rape, mutilation, and torture of the victims. South African police fail to investigate or solve many of these murders, which are carried out by organized gangs, often armed with weapons that police have previously confiscated. The racial character of the killing is covered up by an SA government order prohibiting police from reporting murders by race. Instead, the crisis is denied and the murders are dismissed as ordinary crimes, ignoring the frequent mutilation of the victims' bodies, a sure sign that these are hate crimes. However, independent researchers have compiled accurate statistics demonstrating convincingly that murders among white farm owners occur at a rate of 97 per 100,000 per year, compared to 31 per 100,000 per year in the entire South African population, making the murder rate of white South African farmers one of the highest murder rates in the world. That was published in 2012. In 2015, the 97 per 100,000 per year rate has gone up to 132 per 100,000 per year. Gregory Stanton goes on to say that being a white farmer in South Africa is the most dangerous job in the world. He also says the ANC government has promoted hate speech that constitutes incitement to genocide. The president of the ANC Youth League, Julius Malema, who is now the leader of the Economic Freedom Fighters, revived the Kill the Boer, Kill the Farmer hate song at ANC rallies. And not only that, but President Zuma sings a song called Bring Me My Machine Gun. I will kill the Boers. The Congress will kill the Boers. We will drive them into the sea. That, amongst many economic woes, including being downgraded to junk status by the credit agencies worldwide, are the things that hang over the white South Africans' heads. Apart from being murdered, being driven into squatter camps by 119 race-based laws that exclude them from the workplace, having no access to charity, to running water, to toilets, to electricity, living on discarded rubbish heaps where the government has set them down to live. There is no hope for these people. There is absolutely no hope. And as you can hear from the John Birch piece that I played, the world is not going to come to their aid. So it is up to people like you and myself to help them. Thank you for listening. I will see you again same time next week. God bless South Africa, God bless America, and God help the world that we live in today.